Hi, my name's Mel and welcome back to my channel Bookish Brummy. So every week I do a review video of all the books that I've read in the last week, and in my most recent one I said that I had decided to do a reread of one of my favourite childhood books, which was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. She's also famous for A Little Princess and Little Lord Fauntleroy. Now, I've never read Little Lord Fauntleroy, but I did also read A Little Princess when I was little, although I can't remember too much about that one. But The Secret Garden was always a big favourite of mine. So this is the copy that I actually had when I was a child. I think this one was published in 1994, this version. So these Puffin classics were really popular when I was little, and they would be in box sets as well, so you could get them with other popular children's classic stories like Anne of Green Gables, and I'm pretty sure The Lost World, The Red Badge of Courage, and Journey to the Centre of the Earth by Jules Verne. So you would imagine, what with them being a children's classic, that they would be suitable for children. And yeah, I read this, I say, when I was about 12 years old. But it wasn't just reading the book that I did when I was a child. I had also watched a TV adaptation of it as well. There have been so many films made of The Secret Garden. I mean, absolutely loads. They make them at least once a decade. So I had watched the one that was created in 1975 by the BBC, and it was like a serialised version of The Secret Garden, and then they put them all together on a video, and then it was sort of presented like a film. And I had watched that many times. I think I first started watching that when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I really loved that video, so I used to watch it quite a lot. And then because I'd loved the video, I then, when I was old enough, when I was about 12, decided to actually try and read the book as well, which I'd done. And I just really loved this story, and the story has always stuck with me. But I'm here to tell you now, I think as a child I read this with some blinkers on, and because I didn't quite fully understand the world, there was some really big critical things I did not pick up out of this book when I was reading it as a child. And that is why I've decided to do a review video and go a bit more in depth into this book today, because when I had read it last week, it was like, wow, okay, there's quite a lot of stuff in here that's problematic, and I didn't want to fill up my weekly review video going into all of that. I felt that this book warranted needing its own video to discuss the topics and the themes that I picked up in this book as an adult that I just don't think I picked up as a child. So yeah, as I said, this was the copy that I read when I was a child, but I since went to Book 66 early this year, and Cranford had a really nice copy, like hard copy, and because it had been one of my favourite childhood stories, I wanted to have a more permanent copy than the one that I've got, because paperbacks can disintegrate easily. So I thought that I would buy this version. And as far as the Cranford copy goes, it's a very nice cover. The text is nice. It's sort of like a nice, I don't know if you can see that, it's like a nice size, there's nice spacing around the pages. I don't really like the illustrations that are inside it. I find that they sort of detract from the story a little bit, because you'll read down a page and then you'll get to the next page and then there's a picture with a caption that tries to round up a bit of the story that you just read. But in like one instance, the roundup was a bit too late and it was a bit confusing, and there aren't that many of them interspersed through the book, but I didn't really like that aspect of it. However, in my original copy there are also some illustrations, but I actually think that they sit better in the text than the ones in this one. But this is unabridged, and the one I originally read was unabridged, so I'm not concerned that I'm not understanding the story fully that Frances was trying to tell. So Frances Hodgson Burnett was she actually published this book, The Secret Garden, originally in 1911. So it's thought that the story that we're reading in here is happening in about 1906 and 1907, and that's because The Secret Garden opens up with our main character, Mary Lennox, who is about 9 years old, and she is living in India, and her parents are British living in India, as far as I understand, and they're extremely wealthy, and so they have slaves and people looking after them in their household. Mary has come from a very privileged background. She's extremely spoiled, and she has whatever she wants. And we think that the story is set in about 1906, 1907, because in India at that time there was a massive cholera epidemic. And it's during the cholera epidemic that this book opens up in. So Mary essentially finds herself one day abandoned, and nobody comes to feed her or to dress her or to see her, and she doesn't really understand what's going on. And a couple of days later, some officers come to the house and they discover her and realise that she has been forgotten. And everybody in the household, her parents included, have become victims of the cholera epidemic, and they've died. So she's completely on her own, and she can't stay in India. So she gets shipped off to the UK, where she goes to live in Yorkshire, in a house called Misselthwaite Manor, and the owner of that house is Archibald Craven. And he is her uncle. She's never met him before in her life. I don't think he's ever even been mentioned to her. But when she arrives in London, she's actually met by the housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock, and she is taken to this big house that has supposedly like 100 rooms, and most of them are locked, and it's on these beautiful grounds. And though she doesn't really see the grounds when she gets there, because she seems to arrive, I think, during winter time, and it's really pitch black dark like when she arrives. So it's all completely alien and new to her, a totally different landscape from what she's used to, totally different weather from what she's used to. Nothing is the same. Mrs. Medlock is not exactly the friendliest housekeeper either. She just basically tells her, okay, you're here now, you know, be seen and not heard. So this book is set during the Edwardian time, you know, so like be seen and not heard as a child was, you know, it's like in the Victorian period, really, just sort of carried on into that. You know, it's sort of the way that it was with children. And she said to him, you know, you probably won't see your uncle. He's not particularly interested that you're here. You know, essentially, she's just told, you know, your uncle's doing a duty. He probably won't have anything to do with you. She's not given a governess or anybody who's going to teach her. The closest person that she now has as a parent really is a scullery maid, Martha, who's born and bred in Yorkshire. And Martha is, you know, a really lovely, wholesome woman who comes into Mary's life, and she is nothing like Mary who has ever come across before. You know, Mary is used to being waited on hand and foot by people who are expected to look after her and give her what she wants. So she doesn't even dress herself in India, whereas in the UK, you know, Martha's like, why can't you dress yourself like my brothers and sisters do? And Mary's sort of trying to tell you, yes, but I'm in an elevated position, you know, that's not what is meant to be expected of me. And Martha's sort of a bit like, well, you know, you're gonna have to sort that out for yourself. You know, I'm not a slave, I'm like paid help, and I actually serve Mrs. Medlock. So, you know, Martha sort of puts her in her place a little bit, but also I think Martha is quite endearing in a way, because Martha is just, she has never been exposed to, you know, this sort of service that Mary's on about that she received in India. You know, so she kind of questions and challenges Mary in a way that those in India just probably wouldn't have done, because they would have lost their position in the household that they were in, and probably been severely punished if they did argue with her, to be honest. You know, and Mary even says things like, you know, I screamed in the equivalent of her nanny's face. You know, I slapped her sometimes, like when she wouldn't do what I wanted. And this is one of the first problematic things in the book, I think, that we come across here. And even in the opening pages, it's problematic. So I would probably like just read a little bit out of this. This is the opening page to this book. And it says, she had been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government, and he'd always been busy and ill himself. And her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with gay people. So, right in the opening paragraph here, they're saying that she's a sickly child. She's always been a sickly child because she was born in India, and then her father also lives in India, he's like sickly as well. And it sort of goes on like this, where you sort of get the impression that the author's trying to make out like India is a hot, humid place where people aren't very well. And in England it's, you know, windy and pure, and people can be healthy here. And there's obviously a lot more than just that opening bit that sort of gives you that impression. But that is the impression that the author sort of weaves in throughout the text. she is not particularly polite about Indian people. Indian people actually in this text are referred to as black people. There is no differentiation between people of an Indian origin and people of an African origin. Just anybody who's not white is classed as black. There is a really problematic scene when Mary is arguing with Martha at one point, and you know, I'm not going to repeat the conversation, but it's quite shocking because I think on both sides it shows like Martha's ignorance of people of another colour and shows Mary's hatred of those of another colour. You know, so there's really nothing really very good or positive about that conversation. You know, but like Mary sort of then tries to say to Martha that black people aren't even real people, like, you know, and you know, who cares about their feelings? They're there to serve me, you know. And she gets really angry when Martha thought that when she was coming over from India that she might be native, and Martha had been excited to see someone who wasn't white, you know, which again in itself is problematic, but I think it's explainable in Edwardian times. You know, in Yorkshire you really wouldn't have had many non-white people, and I think that obviously that racism comes from Martha's ignorance. So I don't think that it necessarily comes from a terrible place, like a bad place that she meant harm. It's just her not knowing, and I think that would have been prevalent in society at the time. But Mary, her rant is more of a, you know, of a hatred of them. She sees them as subhuman, you know, they are there to serve her, and she didn't really care about them or their feelings. Now, again, in this book, you know, we take it back in context of where Mary is. You know, she's been brought up in colonial India, and she did have servants, and you know, she's a child, and her parents haven't really got her to have a different impression of people who are not in the privileged position that she's in. So we can sort of understand all these horrible thoughts, and in a way this book really is a window into probably what white westernized people, some of the attitudes that they would have had to anybody considered foreign, or anybody of, you know, who's come from somewhere else who has a different colour. And I think in that respect it's important because we can't forget that they were actually attitudes that existed, and we can't really judge people for having those attitudes back then, because, you know, what they don't know that they don't know. We did not have that social sharing that we have these days, where we can actually sort of figure out, like, no, this is not the right way to think about people, you know. And actually, I think what I'm trying to say is that the kind of discussions that we have today about these things just weren't happening back then, and they weren't really important to people back then to be having those discussions in the UK, for example, because it wasn't really their concern, and they didn't have people of other colours really living in their society. So yeah, I think that the book is important in a way because it shows us what it used to be like, and it's only when you know what it used to be like that you can then move forward and, you know, change society for the better, so that that kind of attitude is not prevalent, and that actually we never see that kind of attitude again, and that, you know, it's stamped out because it's not acceptable. So I can't criticise Frances Hodgson Burnett in a way for writing her characters to have these kind of attitudes, because it is, you know, it's a book of its time. It was, you know, written in the Edwardian period by an Edwardian woman, you know, about white people in Yorkshire, you know, who probably, yeah, this probably wouldn't have been a major concern of theirs. And so for that, no, I can't criticise her, but I think that what's really important in this novel is that if you are going to read this book, if you're going to give this book to a child who isn't white, it could be fairly upsetting, you know, the way that non-white children or non-white people are sort of classified in this book. And especially if, you know, somebody of Indian origin was reading this book, I think that it would be quite offensive and upsetting if it wasn't put into context or had a discussion about it. So, you know, I wouldn't just wrap this up for Christmas for my child without really thinking, okay, there are actually some challenging attitudes in this book about race, and about, you know, skin colour, and actually I should probably have a conversation with my child if they are choosing to read this book. I think back when I was 12, obviously being white and from the UK, I never really picked up on this. I didn't really find it that offensive, but I was only 12 years old and I did not have the worldview that I have now. And also, again, you know, like over 25 years ago, we're living in a different society, and so I think that it just kind of like went over my head. And I don't remember having any conversation with any adults about problematic themes in this book. Now, recent Goodreads reviews that I read on this book after I just finished my reread of it does go into some of this and talks about this. Now, obviously, we didn't have anything like Goodreads again when I was little. So if people were finding it problematic back when I read it in probably like, would have been 1999, I wouldn't have known about it because we just didn't have a way to sort of publicly talk about it. And I've got to be honest, you know, my parents would have given me this book because, you know, they probably read it when they were children, and again, that kind of thing had just gone over their head and they not thought about it. They didn't reread it as an adult and think, oh, okay, this is something that we need to have a conversation about. Okay, and I don't remember asking any questions in it. So that was really shocking to me, to then read this text and then have that suddenly, I was like, oh wow. And I think in the adaptation that I read, I can't really, not read, that I watched, I can't really remember much again with regards to the racial aspect of it. But it was so long ago, and I was really quite young when I was watching it, and I don't have access to watch this anymore because I don't have video. I don't even own the video anymore, and they probably don't even make that version of The Secret Garden because so many versions have been made, so there's about one a decade. I haven't watched any of the new versions of The Secret Garden. I'd never wanted to because I'd really enjoyed the one that I had watched in my childhood, and I didn't want to ruin that nostalgia from my childhood by watching a newer one. But I would be interested with a newer one as to how they navigated that aspect of it, because I think it would be quite offensive now if you were to literally put the text that's in this book directly onto the screen. So maybe they've handled it in a more sensitive way. I don't know, you'll have to tell me down in the comments below if you've watched a more recent version of it. So yeah, there is a fair bit of racism in here that I think needs to be discussed if you're going to give this to a child to read, or you know, it really needs to be thought about. But there's other stuff in here that again is quite problematic, and I'm going to talk about the child abuse that's in here. And I'm not sure that I've actually seen people talk about the child abuse, and again, me reading this as a child, I don't think I had the worldview to consider the child abuse in this book. So there's emotional abuse towards Mary, but there's also emotional abuse towards our other main character, Colin. Now, Colin, we've not mentioned him yet, but he is actually Mr. Craven's son, and he is kept locked away in his bedroom. And Miss Craven doesn't mention him to anybody, doesn't really have anything to do with his son. None of the servants at Misselthwaite Manor will talk to Mary about Colin at the beginning. She doesn't even know that he's there. Like, you know, they keep him quiet. So he's also emotionally neglected as well, like right from the off. So I think this conversation is going to shift into Colin more in a little while, but I will start with Mary. So Mary, from the opening lines that I read there, we can see that her parents didn't really care very much for her. They didn't, they weren't there for her emotionally, and they weren't even really there for her physically. They were off doing their own thing, and they were like paying people or ordering people to take care of her. And you know, it does say that in the book that if she was to cry as a small child, then her mum would get really angry at the people looking after her. So they did everything to make sure that she had everything that she wanted, but this made her into a really spoiled little girl, you know. And this really shows when she comes to Misselthwaite Manor, and you know, she comes across Martha and Mrs. Medlock, and she just can't really get her own way all the time, and things are operating differently, and there aren't people like bowing and scraping. And there's even a scene where, you know, she's even waiting for Martha to put her shoes on for her. She won't even like push her feet into her shoes. She's like, oh, I didn't know that was my job. I thought that was your job to do that for me. And what makes me really sad, after she's sort of settled in a little bit and she started walking around the grounds and getting to know nature, she meets one of the gardeners called Ben Weatherstaff. And he's quite a edgy, grumpy gardener, but he does talk to her from time to time, and he has this robin that sort of follows him around, and he introduces her to the robin. And she really likes the robin. The robin is like one of the first things that she's ever actually liked. And she's sort of thinking to herself, oh, there's a line where she's talking about 5 things that she has now discovered that she likes. And there was the robin, Ben Weatherstaff, Dickon, who is Martha's brother, Martha, and I can't remember what the 5th one was. But this child is now at 10 years old, and for the first time in her life there are now like 5 things that she likes, and that's just really, really sad. It really shows, like, mentally, you know, how deprived she has been of love and affection, and, you know, a child who is not given any love and affection or is shown how to make friends or be compassionate towards another person, you know, is not in return probably going to have any friends, or, you know, they're not going to know how to do that. They're not going to know how to forge those relationships with people. So when Mary first comes to Misselthwaite, you know, she's only ever used to ordering people around. She doesn't know how to talk to them on their level, and that is something that she has to start to learn to do. And as she starts to learn to do that, she becomes a happier child, and she sort of sees that in herself, and we do see that character growth. But I just find it really sad how, you know, abandoned she has been, and even before her parents died, you know, how little they wanted anything to do with her. And I think that that's really important, because it kind of, you know, has set up the kind of person that she is when this book starts. Now, again, we've mentioned Colin Craven, and Colin is also, you know, neglected in many ways, and the reason why he seems to be neglected is because he is potentially disabled, although he's not disabled in the end. Now, Colin is a victim of Munchausen's by proxy, I'm sure of it. Now, I'm just going to read off. I asked the internet to describe what Munchausen by proxy was, so I could read it out properly, just so it's not like I've made it up or anything. But it is authoritatively and falsely presenting another adult, child or pet to others as physically or mentally impaired. And this is exactly what is happening to Colin before we even, like, really got into meeting Colin. So it's a bit complicated, but essentially Colin's mother appears to have died at the same time as Colin, but there also seems to have been an accident in the secret garden, and obviously the garden is what the book is named after and where they spend all their time. But she seems to have had an accident in that garden, and then she's, you know, died the day after somebody told Mary, and then in another story she had Colin and then she died. So we don't really know if she gave birth to Colin and then was in the garden, had an accident and died, or if she was pregnant with Colin and then had an accident in the garden, and then that caused labour and Colin was born and then she died. Now, Colin's father seems to blame Colin for the death of his mother. So this is why I sort of have it in my head that potentially she must have died somehow in childbirth, because otherwise I can't see how he could think that Colin was anything to do with the death of his wife. But then obviously he's grieving for the loss of his wife, but then when his child is born, the child is quite sickly, and they think that he might end up with a crooked back or a hunchback. So I think, you know, in today's world that would probably be classed as scoliosis. Mr. Craven himself does have a slight hunch on his back, but that seems to be a bit of a different condition to what they're describing for Colin. They're trying to say that they think he'll have a crooked back, which is what makes me think that he might have had scoliosis. So I'm just going to read out a passage where Colin's father is actually talking about how he feels about Colin. And again, this is really sad. So it says, thinking of his boy as he had never thought in all the 10 years past, During those years, he'd only wished to forget him. Now, though, he did not intend to think about him. Memories of him constantly drifted into his mind. He remembered the black days when he had raved like a madman because the child was alive and the mother was dead. He had refused to see it, and when he had gone to look at it at last, it had been such a weak, wretched thing that everybody had been sure it would die in a few days. But to the surprise of those who took care of it, the days passed and it lived, and then everyone believed it would be a deformed and crippled creature. So this is how Colin's own father viewed his son, and he's actually describing him as an it. And it's really sad, because he's like talking about Colin like he's worthless, not only because his mother's died, but because he's, you know, potentially going to be malformed. And the use of the word cripple towards Colin is really, really high in this book. There's also the doctor, who is a cousin of Mr. Craven. And again, he seems to go along with this idea that Colin is going to be deformed. So there is a point in the book where Mary has met Colin and she's convinced Colin to go outside, and Colin would never normally go outside. So Dr. Craven's gone to visit him just to see if he's up to it. And it says, Dr. Craven felt rather alarmed. If this tiresome, hysterical boy should chance to get well, he himself would lose all chance of inheriting Misselthwaite. But he was not an unscrupulous man, though he was a weak one, and he did not intend to let him run into actual danger. So the boy's doctor, who's actually been seen to him since he was a child as well, potentially is going to inherit the home that they're in. So he sort of has ulterior motives about being Colin's doctor, I think. You know, he can't be rational and say, you know, there's nothing wrong with this kid, he's going to be absolutely fine. He actually would prefer Colin to die so that you know, there's nobody left to inherit the property when when Mr. Archibald Craven dies, then Dr. Craven would inherit it. So that's really sad and a massive abuse of power, you know. And we have the nurse who's nursing Colin says to Mary at one point, Mary says, is he going to die? And the nurse says, I don't know and I don't care, said the nurse. Hysterics and temper are half of what ails him. So even the nurse, who's, you know, is paid to look after Colin, doesn't care about him. But she also realises there's nothing actually physically wrong with him, you know. So I thought that was really sad. So when Mary meets Colin, he's like holed up in his bedroom and he thinks that he's going to die. And he tells Mary, you know, I'm going to die. They've been saying it ever since I'm little. They sit there, they whisper next to the bed, you know, they say I'm going to be a hunchback. They say, you know, I'm a cripple. I'm a big disappointment. My father doesn't want anything to do with me, you know. And Colin is only 10 years old himself. And it's just absolutely shocking that everybody in his life, basically from the moment he's been born, has allowed him just to stay in bed, and they've all been telling him over and over again, don't look forward to the future, you're going to die, and, you know, your father doesn't really like you because, you know, you're a cripple. And Colin even refers to himself as not a real boy in this, which is really, really sad, you know. So I think, as well as the Munchausen's by proxy and, you know, that kind of child abuse that's going on towards Colin by all of the adults around him that are meant to be keeping him safe and actually seem to have ulterior motives, and they just seem like really, truly awful people, every single one of them that's around him, you know. You've got like that going on, and that's upsetting in itself. But then you need to think again, if you were given this book to a child and that child did have a disability or had scoliosis or had some reason why they couldn't walk, they might be quite upset by this book, because I don't know if, I mean, maybe attitudes at the time in the Edwardian period did not take kindly to disabled people or disabled children. I've got to be honest, I don't really know about that, but I'm assuming that's the case, and that's why these characters again have been written in this way. But it's quite offensive. And there is another scene with Ben Weatherstaff when he meets Colin for the first time and sees Colin standing up for the first time. You know, he's like, oh, I'm really surprised. What people told me was a lie. I thought you were a half-wit and crooked, you know. And so again, we see here that everybody in the local town thinks that Colin is disabled and that he's got a crooked back and that he's unable to walk, and then somehow his intelligence is also been removed from him as well. And you know, there's nobody that's ever said at any point to him in his household that they think that he's intellectually challenged or anything like that. And actually, when he's in bed, he knows how to read. He sits there reading and thinking about things. And you know, intellectually he's not challenged at all. But the prevailing idea is that because he's physically disabled, he must also be mentally disabled as well. So this is the impression that Colin is given about himself, and they talk about the hysterics that he has and all the crying that he does, and you think to yourself, well, he's a scared little boy who thinks that he could die, and nobody's really told him any different, and it's actually seems to be in some people's interests if he does die, so he probably doesn't trust any of them, and he's absolutely full of hatred. He hates them all, and you can understand why that would be. And he's having a tantrum one night, and they decide that they're going to send Mary in to calm him down because she seems to have a way of talking to him. And her being a child, you know, she doesn't really understand all this backstory as to, you know, why they think he's going to die, because every time she's looked at him, he seemed absolutely fine to her. He seemed sound of mind, and she can't see anything physically wrong with him. And that's not to say that there couldn't be, but in her childish mind, she sort of is challenging that, because she's like, well, we're always having, you know, a level conversation with each other, and how do you know that you can't walk? Like, why don't you get out of bed and try? And anyway, Colin is having this massive tantrum, and when she starts to talk to him to get him to calm down, he's screaming at her like, you know, you basically should have more sympathy for me because I have a lump on my spine and I'm going to die. And she says, you have a lump on your spine? And she questions this, and she asks him to lift up his top, and she examines his back, and she cannot find a single lump on him, and she tells him this. She's like, your spine looks the same as mine, there's nothing wrong with it. And this actually stops him mid-tantrum, and he starts to calm down, and eventually she sings him to sleep. And like, the nurse is thinking, is that what you were thinking, that you had a lump on your spine? And in a way, like, that really annoyed me that the nurse said that, because, well, he thinks this because you all keep trying to indicate to him that that's what's going to happen to him and that's what's going to kill him. Now, I don't know how him having a lump on his spine could kill him, but this is what they've made him believe, you know. Yet, earlier on in the book, she had said to Mary that all that ailed him was basically hysterics and a bad temper. So, you know, the nurse and the people around him aren't even making him see that actually, you know, none of this is going to happen to you, nothing is wrong. So it's only when Mary comes into his life that he begins to improve, and that he begins to have a friend, and he begins to understand, you know, how to talk to people. And he has a similar revelation that Mary did, that, oh, I've actually begun to like the garden. I quite like Mary, and he likes Dickon, Martha's brother. He meets him, and he likes the animals, and he likes to be outside. And this is the first time in his 10 years either that he has actually liked things or people, you know, and that's really, really sad. And this growth, you know, between the children comes because, you know, they are there for each other, and they have like a very brother-sister relationship in a way, you know, and Mary just doesn't let Colin get away with the things that he used to get away with, that, you know, the servants let him get away with. And him, the same with her, you know, the way he talks to her, he won't let her get away with ordering him around, or, you know, how she used to with people in India. So we see a lot of growth between these children. But I think, like, what sort of makes me a bit mad in this book, apart from all this child abuse that's going on, is that the adults talk about Mary and Colin in a way that, you know, all of their unhappiness, and they keep referring to Mary when she got there, saying that she was really ugly because she had a really sour face, you know, and they're saying, oh, now you're happier, like, you're really pretty, which again is a bit weird, because it's like, well, I don't think that your mood really affects how you physically look, you know, and that's maybe a different conversation. But, you know, they make out like all of the problems that Colin and Mary have had up until now are of their own making, and none of the adults in this book seem to accept responsibility really for the fact that they have caused these two children to be the way that they are. And there's a bit in here that has been written which says, So long as Colin shut himself in his room and thought only of his fears and weaknesses and his detestation of people who looked at him and reflected hourly on humps and early death, he was a hysterical, half-crazy little hypochondriac who knew nothing of the sunshine and the spring, and also did not know that he could get well and could stand upon his feet if he tried to do it. And again, the way this is written, it's like it's Colin's fault. It's really not Colin's fault. I don't think that Colin or Mary, to be honest, in this book are either of them particularly nice characters, but you can definitely see how they have, you know, been created, if you like, by the negligence of the adults around them. Now, when I read this book back when I was 12 years old, I didn't pick up really on any of this again. The main part of the book for me that was the bit that I really enjoyed and that I took with me through all these years since I last read it is how descriptive it is of the secret garden, but also the wild, being outside, and the changing of the seasons. I'm very much an outdoors person, and you know, I run very frequently, so I'm always very aware of the changing of the seasons. I could probably tell you on any which day, you know, like what the wind speed is and how that's going to feel and what you should wear to be outside if you're going for a run. I'm really attuned to it, so I think that you know, in this book, that you really get a sense of that. And whilst I've really become a runner as an adult, when I was a child I was constantly outside, like barefoot, scrubbing around in the grass, and in the trees, you know, and then I'd always go on bike rides as well and be outside. I'd always go walking with my grandparents, so I've always been an outside person, and that was the magic of this book and the film for me, was that element of the being outside. And the secret garden, like the very idea of having a secret garden is quite exciting to me as a child, but even as an adult now, you know, I like the idea of having a garden that's secret and overgrown, and you know, it's not too pruned or polished or whatever, which is exactly like how the garden is in this book. So you know, for that aspect of it, when I reread that bit of the book, that magic was still there, and I think that Frances Hodgson Burnett did a really good job of doing that and creating that magical, you know, vision. But when you sort of extrapolate everything else that's actually in this, it's such a dark book, really, when you're thinking about how these children are treated. And I do wonder, if we were to come back to the Edwardian period, about how children were seen and not heard, you know, I don't think that children were necessarily nurtured to the extent possibly that they are today. But there is one character in this book who is Martha's mother, and she has brought up, I think, 12 or 14 children, and she seems very attuned as to how to be with children, and she often advises Mrs. Medlock on, you know, what the best thing they should do for Mary or Colin is, and she even writes to Mr. Craven occasionally about what he should be doing, and they seem to accept her advice, you know. So she really loved her children, and she was very motherly towards Mary and Colin at the end of the book, and she did a lot for them despite her being extremely poor and trying to raise a massive family on no money at all. She still gave what she could to Mary and Colin. So it indicates to me that there were people who had attitudes towards their children that were to, you know, emotionally nourish their children and to be physically there for them like she was. So, you know, maybe we're talking more about like the upper class having this distant relationship with their children. I don't know, because we see it repeated in India with Mary, and we see it repeated at Misselthwaite. But at the same time, you know, you've got, if he's her uncle, if Mr. Craven, Archibald Craven, is Mary's uncle, I believe his sister was her mother, who was also really cold with her. So it could also just be a fact of this brother and sister have had a terrible upbringing, and now in raising their two children separately, they've now carried that down and given both of their children a fairly terrible upbringing in that respect. You know, and just assume they'd pay everybody to do the raising of their children for them, and you know, as long as they paid to give them what they wanted, then surely they would turn out to be reasonable human beings. So I don't know, it's very hard to know where that attitude towards the children has come from, but you know, worryingly, Mrs. Medlock and the nurse, you know, and Dr. Craven as well, they sort of seem to uphold this attitude towards the children. And I found that really, really sad. And I think it ruined the magic of the book a little bit for me. I would have previously said, you know, this is my favourite book, and from my childhood. I have two. I have Watership Down and I have The Secret Garden from my childhood, and I'd given them both a 5-star. On a reread of this book, I just cannot do that. The emotional neglect of the children, and the way that people have behaved towards Colin, the racism, the ableism, all of that actually just makes it quite a heavy and a dark book, and it does make me wonder if it is actually really a children's book. If I'm honest, I feel like, you know, you could write thousands and thousands of words on the different aspects of this book that are now problematic. It hasn't aged well, and I'm not saying that the book should be banned or anything like that, because, you know, books are written in a certain time and they reflect the values and thoughts of the people who lived in that time. And, you know, this book was published in 1911. You know, the book is over 100 years old. Can't possibly expect it to reflect what we think as a society now. So I think books like that are actually important for us to get a window into that time that they were written. But I don't think I'd necessarily call it a children's book, or I don't think it's that happy to give to a child, really. You could leave your child to read it unattended, and maybe your child would do what I had done and not really seen all the abuse and the racism and the ableism and everything else, and, you know, just enjoyed the imagery presented by the garden and the wonder of the garden. But I think that would be doing it a disservice. I think, you know, that it's actually worth using it as a piece from that time to have discussions about all the darker elements of this book that are in there. So yeah, I really felt like I wanted to do a deep dive into this book because there was so much more to say about it. I'm now not thinking this book is a 5. I'd actually rate this now as a 2.5, because there's just, you know, I feel like if I was to walk around it today and say, oh, this is one of my favourite books, people are probably looking at me thinking racist, you know, and it's not. It's just simply the fact that I had not picked this up as an adult and then consumed it as an adult. You know, I'd only been looking at it through rose-tinted lenses of being a child when I'd read that book. I have to admit, I'm a little bit scared to read Watership Down now as to what might come out of that. However, I feel like that's probably aged better. I've seen more people say that they've read that recently, you know, and with rabbits, you know, maybe it's not as offensive as people. Like, I don't know. I'm sure in 2026 I probably will do a reread of Watership Down, because whilst this has gone down in my estimation as a story, as a children's story, I'm glad I did this reread, because I feel far more informed about, you know, this book now. And I don't think I would just turn up, you know, at a dinner party and be like, oh yeah, you know, The Secret Garden is a wonderful children's story, and I certainly wouldn't wrap it up for a child now without maybe having a conversation with their mum and dad about how they felt about them having that book. So if you have read The Secret Garden as an adult, if you've read it recently, let me know if you agree or disagree with any of the comments that I've made in this video. Let me know as well, did you read it as a child and then reread it as an adult and then had a total, you know, different belief about what you actually thought of the book and like what you got out of the book, like me? Because for me, I just found that it was quite a shocking reversal of, oh, I love this book, to, oh my god, like, what is this book? So yeah, let me know in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next book review. Bye!